All right, so this is something that I haven't really had too much of a chance to get into much detail on in regards to the ongoing situation with Israel and Hamas, and that is the hostages that were taken captive by Hamas during their October 7th attack into southern Israel. It's estimated that there's roughly over 200 or so that were taken back to the Gaza Strip during this attack. Some of those are civilians, some of those are military members of the Israeli military, and so there's a lot that I wanted to get into here. So obviously we have had the negotiated, or even in some cases non-negotiated, release of some of these hostages. Some of the negotiations were in regards to Israeli American citizens, where the U.S. government sort of stepped in and worked out some sort of a deal with Hamas that was facilitated through the government of Qatar, obviously a U.S. ally that also has close ties to Hamas as well. And so we got a couple of different American civilians that were released as a part of that, and we'll touch on some of their family members' statements here in a minute. But before that, I just want to get to the most recent release of a couple of these elderly Israeli hostages that it seems like were basically just released by Hamas because of their age, because of their status. They said it was under humanitarian conditions that they decided to free these hostages. And so I wanted to show you guys a couple of different things here, because it's not just about, obviously the testimony we're going to get to here from the actual hostage that was released back into Israel, but also what seems to be sort of, I'll say, questionable at the very least, strategies that are currently being deployed by the government of Israel in attempting or not attempting to get back some of these hostages. So let's go ahead and watch this direct testimony here from one of the people who was returned by Hamas just yesterday.
Did you shake that Hamas activist hand when you crossed? Because they treated us very nicely. My mom is saying that they were very delicate and gentle with them and took care of all their needs. They seemed really prepared for it. They had concealed it for a long time, and they took care of all the needs that women need: shampoo, conditioner. Did they tell you anything about what was happening outside?
Okay, so, I mean, that's the gist of it. Now, there have been a lot of Israeli politicians who have sort of actually, openly gotten mad at these freed hostages, because it seems like they, in the eyes of the Israeli government, they're giving Hamas some sort of a PR victory by saying, well, they actually treated us somewhat fairly. Now, I don't want to downplay the situation, right? I don't want to act as if Hamas is, in the right in this situation. I mean, obviously, taking civilians as hostages, I don't think is acceptable in any condition whatsoever. But, I mean, that's just her testimony, right? So you have to take that, as it is. Now, again, I don't want to just make this seem as if it's all hunky-dory, right? It's all like a rosy picture here or something. I mean, obviously, they also described the entire attack on October 7th as absolute hell, but they did say that, some of these Hamas people were giving them access to food and water and medical treatment if it was needed for some of the hostages that were taken. We have a direct quote in terms of some of the brutality that they were faced with on October 7th. She said, "I went through hell that we had never imagined." The Hamas terrorists rampage through the kibbutz, and they say that she derided Israel's costly border fence with Gaza, which she said was the invaders blew up with ease and had been no help at all in defending the kibbutz against the terrorist mob. And they say some 180 of the kibbutz's 400 residents were killed or abducted, according to the New York Times. And of course, they give the total there of roughly 1,400 people who were killed during this Hamas offensive into southern Israel. So, I mean, again, I'm not trying to downplay it. Obviously, being kidnapped, being taken as a hostage in any situation is going to be absolute hell. It's going to be terrifying, but that was her testimony there. And so it kind of plays into another aspect of this that I want to get to, which, is Israel's response to the current hostage situation. Because clearly, I think that if Hamas is freeing these hostages and also was able to work out some sort of a deal through Qatar to release Israeli American hostages, then it seems like there could be a path forward towards negotiating to get the rest of these hostages freed. And it seems like, based on what we've seen so far in some of the recent statements from the Israeli government, that they're not really too inclined to do that. And so before we get to some of those statements here and some of that context, I want to just show you guys an interview that was done. Now, this is the family of the Israeli Americans who ended up being freed after these negotiations. And I just want you guys to take note of what they're saying needs to be done here, or what they want to see from the Israeli government in this moment ahead of their, incoming or imminent ground invasion into the Gaza Strip. Obviously, after an absolutely brutal bombing campaign over the last couple of weeks.
Would you prefer that Israel delays its ground invasion until every avenue has been attempted to bring the hostages back?
We demand it. They need to do everything to get the hostages back, to get our family back, and 200 more families, loved ones back, before anything is even on the table. The hostages, they are civilians. This is the basic contract between the country and us. The civilians come first.
So, I mean, there you go. Obviously, I mean, a very clear message here from one of the families that was actually able to successfully get some of their family members back. You know, obviously, you feel for them and what they had to go through, and, you know, obviously it's a good thing that they were able to get their family members back. But as they pointed out there, you know, there are still potentially hundreds of families out there who have family members who are currently being held in the Gaza Strip, and it kind of sort of seems like there's a massive contradiction here between what a lot of these people, the actual family members of the hostages, are asking of the Benjamin Netanyahu government versus what they're actually doing. Okay, so here from the Times of Israel, Netanyahu's office calls Hamas's claim that it offered to free 2 hostages, quote, propaganda lies. They say Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office says that it will not respond after Hamas claimed to have offered to release 2 hostages but was rejected by Israel. The spokesperson for Hamas's military wing, okay, said earlier today that the terror group informed Qatar yesterday that they would release 2 hostages held in the Gaza Strip, but that Israel refused to accept them, okay? And they say that the 2 hostages said that they would have been released for humanitarian reasons. Now, again, this appears to be the 2 hostages that were just released, and Netanyahu again said, we won't respond to Hamas's propaganda lies. We will continue to do everything possible to return all of the hostages and missing home. So, I mean, what are we really talking about here? I mean, obviously, if they just released a couple of these hostages, they already cut a deal with, you know, through the government of Qatar to release some Israeli-American hostages. Clearly, there is something you could do here, right? I mean, it's not as if they're not willing to negotiate. It's not as if there's no deal that you could possibly put on the table to try to fix this situation, right? And it seems like that's very clear, but they're just turning around and saying it's propaganda lies. Hamas would never release any of these hostages, and it's like they already have. I mean, including potentially the 2 specific hostages that Israel was referencing here in this statement about propaganda lies. So, I mean, that aspect of it, I mean, think about if you are, you know, an Israeli citizen and your family member is being held captive in Gaza right now. Your own government is engaging in an absolutely brutal bombing campaign where one of your family members could get caught and killed as a part of that bombing campaign, or killed as a part of this upcoming ground invasion. And it seems like your government is outright rejecting some offers to get your family member back. Okay, and keep in mind, I mean, we've had previous examples of this, and also I think it's important to mention that the government of Israel also has Palestinian hostages, right? They just call it a different thing. I mean, I can't tell you guys how many different videos I've seen over the last couple of days of Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, little kids, you know, some as young as like 3 years old to 10 years old or 15 years old or whatever, who are being rounded up and arrested by the IDF, by the Israeli security forces, and held captive. I mean, you can say, okay, well, we're holding them as prisoners or whatever because they were holding a stone at the time that we arrested them or something, right? And maybe they would have thrown that at an IDF, you know, officer who's invading their territory, right? You could say that, but you could also say that's also a captive. It's a different form of hostage taking. And so the point that I'm bringing up there is just that we've seen examples throughout recent history where Hamas is willing to negotiate the release of their own hostages, of Israeli hostages, in exchange for Palestinians who are also being held captive by the Israeli military or the Israeli security forces. So again, it seems like there are lots of things that could be put on the table in order to try to get these hostages freed, including, you know, preventing this upcoming ground invasion into Gaza, which, as I've talked about extensively on this channel, I don't think is going to produce anything good, not just for the people of Gaza, who have already been suffering under the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, but also won't produce, you know, any sort of lasting security for the people of Israel either, and certainly won't produce any good outcomes for the people, the Israelis still held captive by Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. And so again, I mean, we have more evidence here of that from Ryan Grimm. He says the IDF tells the Times of Israel that it is concerned that Hamas might release more hostages. Okay, let me say that again. The IDF is saying that it's concerned that Hamas might release more hostages, which could then delay the ground invasion. Okay, so what they're saying here is we are preparing to do this ground invasion any day now, any moment right now. And if Hamas keeps releasing hostages, okay, or trying to cut deals to release hostages, then that may give them somewhat of a PR victory or a propaganda win, as they're calling it. And then that could potentially show the Israeli people or the American people that, hey, maybe we could try to work out some sort of a deal before this ground invasion takes place. And that may delay the ground invasion, which gives Israel less of a time or less of a justification to go into Gaza guns blazing in sort of this revenge tour that they are planning on going on right now. And so that's what's really going on here. It seems like Israel is quite literally willing to sacrifice their own citizens who are being held captive by Hamas in order to justify going into Gaza with this ground invasion. It seems like that's actually what's happening here, and they're almost not even really hiding it, according to statements like this, right? I mean, again, IDF says it's concerned Hamas might release more hostages. If your primary goal, as it should be, would be getting these hostages back, then it seems like that wouldn't be a concern. It seems like the release of more hostages would be a good thing, But we continue here, okay? And this is also from a U.S. perspective as well. Following Hamas's release of 2 hostages, the US and several EU governments are quietly pushing Israel to hold off on the ground invasion, fearing that it'll all but scuttle efforts to secure additional hostage releases for the foreseeable future, okay? The senior diplomatic officials tell the Times of Israel. So it also seems like the US government, other European governments, are also behind the scenes telling Israel the same thing that I just said, which is that if you guys rush this ground invasion and you go in, you might actually be preventing the possibility of getting some of these hostages freed. Now think back again to those family members who luckily got their own family members back as hostages released from Hamas. But think about every other family within Israel that wants to see their family members back. And you have all of these other governments around the world, even the United States, the biggest backer and supporter of the government of Israel, all of these other European governments who are saying, whoa, you might want to hold off. You might want to give it a little bit more time to try to negotiate the release of these hostages. And your own government is saying, no, we can't do that. That'll give Hamas a PR victory or a propaganda win. And we don't want the hostages to be released because we want more of a justification to do this ground invasion. I mean, what are we really talking about here? It's absolutely insane. We also had this, which was probably the most insane aspect of this entire hostage situation that I've seen so far, of Benjamin Netanyahu, who obviously has been facing an incredible amount of pressure domestically within Israel for his actions preceding the October 7th attack into southern Israel, as well as his handling since then. Obviously, the overwhelming majority, according to the polling data that I've covered on this channel, of Israeli citizens blame Benjamin Netanyahu for all of this chaos. But I mean, listen to the situation here from, this was posted by Haaretz, I believe. They say, in his last statement to the nation on Saturday evening, Netanyahu claimed to have spoken to those who lost their loved ones or whose fate is unknown, meaning hostages, but no actual family member of a hostage was identified as having spoken to him. So he just made that shit up. On Sunday, he finally met a group of representatives from the Hostages and Missing Families Forum when suddenly a man who claimed to also be a relative of a hostage entered the meeting and started praising the prime minister and saying that he trusted any decision that he makes. But wait for it. It has since emerged that that man, who was claiming to be a family member of the hostages, is a far-right activist with ties to members of the Netanyahu family and no ties to the hostages. The man's wife, meanwhile, had organized a counter-protest outside the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv, opposite the family's vigil. And some of the protesters screamed abuse at the forum members. So you have a couple of people who infiltrate this meeting that is supposed to be, sort of between Benjamin Netanyahu and representatives of the hostages, and you have some guy and his fucking wife who are like far-right activists who have been conducting protests where they're abusing members of, family members who have been taken hostage by Hamas, and they're going in there and pretending as if, we entirely endorse Benjamin Netanyahu and everything that he does, right? I'm a member of a family member who was taken hostage by Hamas. Meanwhile, they just completely made that shit up. I mean, this is just completely insane at this point, right? We also have this aspect that I'll finish off here on from Trita Parsi. He says, wow, U.S. officials tell Yonatan Tuval that Israel's ground invasion has been delayed to give the United States time to prepare for the broader regional war Israel's invasion of Gaza will spark. So there's a couple of different things here that are going on. Obviously, you have the influence from the United States saying that we want you to delay this ground invasion because that will potentially cut off the ability for us to negotiate for the release of more Israeli-American hostages or Israeli-European hostages or whatever the case may be. So that's number one. Obviously, I mean, I think that's a good thing. I think that we shouldn't be endorsing this invasion in any way, shape, or form, although we have been giving them technical support, intelligence support. We've been sending Marine generals to go help with the planning of this invasion. I mean, all of that, sending them weapons and aid and all of that, right? So obviously we are sort of endorsing this invasion, but at least they're telling them, okay, maybe put this off, and hopefully, I guess, in my ideal world, right, you would delay until the point where they see that there's no longer a window for this kind of an invasion to take place. But then you also have this narrative that Trita Parsi was just pointing out there that I think could be somewhat true, given the increased presence of the U.S. military in the region, whether it's in the Red Sea or the Mediterranean or, you know, in any of our different bases in Iraq and Syria and the rest. You know, there also is this idea that, like, okay, maybe part of the reason the U.S. wants them to delay this ground invasion is so that we can get ready for the potential inevitability that the Israeli invasion into Gaza is going to spark a broader Middle Eastern war. And then before you know it, we could have a tit-for-tat escalation with groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis that have already launched attacks either in the direction of Israel or at the United States elements that are currently within the Middle East, right? We had the USS Carney just a couple of days ago, this U.S. warship that shot down a couple of ballistic missiles, I believe, that were headed from Yemen. And so, you know, we already have this sort of tit-for-tat escalation that's taking place between the United States, between Hezbollah and the Houthis, which are both Iran-backed sort of militias, okay? And we have this escalation within Gaza with this potential Israeli ground invasion. And then the question becomes, okay, if they go into Gaza, they do this ground invasion where they might get clapped up anyways because a lot of these soldiers aren't prepared for this kind of a thing because they've been spending all of their time in the West Bank as part of the Israeli settler colonial project, you know, and then that could spark off a northern offensive from Hezbollah. It could spark off increased attacks from the Houthis in Yemen against U.S., you know, warships or whatever the case may be. And then you could have this prospect of Iran getting more directly involved or other elements within Syria and Iraq. And so, I mean, this is how we very easily spiral towards a broader Middle Eastern war or even like a World War III kind of situation. And I wouldn't be bringing that up to you guys if I didn't think that that was legitimately on the table. But I seriously think that we are closer to a broader war like that, whether it's World War III or whether it's a huge Middle Eastern explosion involving the United States directly. I think we're closer to that scenario now than arguably we had been throughout the entirety of the Ukraine and Russian war so far over the last couple of years. So I mean, this is a fucking nightmare situation. It's a disaster. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is a disaster. The aid that's been getting in or trickling in isn't goddamn nearly enough. You have Israel basically insisting on continuing to level Gaza, continuing to restrict the electricity, the medical supplies, the water access within Gaza, and preparing for this ground invasion that not only is going to be an absolute humanitarian disaster, but arguably is not even going to, you know, lead for more security for Israel in long run, but could potentially spark this into a massive Middle Eastern war involving the United States as well.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying